My dearest children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, I'll start this as a letter to you, and maybe it'll be easier to get started. I've waited a long time to get started on this life story and journal, and I'm sorry I've waited so long, so I guess this is a good place to start. I'll start in the present, as it is today. This is your grandma, Thelma McMullin. Well, Thelma Hopkins Gillespie McMullin, because my children were all Gillespies. This is January the 23rd, 1983 in Utah's Dixie. It is 71 years, 3 months, and 23 days since I was born. So I have been a long time getting started on this life story and journal. I did keep a diary when I was in my teens, but when I left home and married, it was left behind. This is a beautiful Sabbath day in Utah's Dixie, not sunny as one would imagine. It is the rainy season, so we have had showers off and on all day. Everything looks so clean and just washed. We had ward conference today. There were state visitors and the chapel was overflowing. The meeting was perfect, such good speakers and music. The ward choir sang, "I'll go where you want me to go." My heart is full of memories, remembering other conferences, when the family was at home, when my dear husband and I, with all our children, took up nearly a full bench in the chapel. Other things come to mind as I recall what was happening 40 years ago today. I picture the little hospital at Palmdale, California. It was 3 days since the birth of my baby, and I was still living in the wonder of my first son. He was such a lovely baby, so perfect in every way. Yesterday, Saturday, was a wonderful day, too. I'm still enjoying the memories. My son Guy, his wife Cheryl, and 3 of their children, Carol Lee, Ricky, and Randy, also my daughter Donna Ray and her youngest daughter Shannon, came to St. George from Boulder City, Nevada. Guy and Cheryl were going to Cedar City to sign the final papers on their home, so I went up with them. Donna Ray stayed in St. George to visit her 2 sisters here. After the business was finished in Cedar, we drove around town, seeing old and familiar places, remembering back when we used to live there. We had lunch in Cedar City, then back to St. George in time for a family get-together. We stopped at the Bargain Barn in St. George to find Delilah, Donna Ray, and Madge, or Midgie. There was so much to look at in the Bargain Barn, it took nearly an hour to round up everyone and get on over to Delilah's home. All my children together for the first time in many months. My heart was full of love and pride. As my thoughts wander, I think of another time, 50 years ago. The place is the Jensen Farm in Cedar Valley. We, my husband and I, were outside most of the day, burning the huge piles of dry thistle that we had piled up earlier in the fall in preparation to plow the field. It was a beautiful sunny day, but the field was white with snow. It is cold in Cedar at that time. It was cold, and we enjoyed the heat from the fires. How active I was, and so excited about life. It was 1 month and 3 days before my first baby was expected. Everything I did was new and exciting. My life seemed to be just beginning. I was married to a man I had loved for years, but I didn't think he would ever pay any attention to me. I'm getting ahead of myself in this story, and as it is to be the story of my life, I should start at the beginning. I don't remember the first years, of course, but I have heard enough stories, I should be able to fill it in. I was fortunate to be born into a family who had close relationships. From my first day of life, uncles, aunts, and cousins were my everyday companions. I was born at the home of my Aunt Lottie Pierce in Paradise, Utah, and my Grandma Lemons was there. To put everything in place, I should start with my mother's marriage, because that was the beginning, or almost the beginning of my life. She, Jeanette Lemons, was living with her family at Garfield, Utah. Her mother, my Grandma Lemons, had separated from Grandpa a year or so before because he had been drinking and it just got to be too much for her. He had went on south to Cedar City where his sister lived and Grandma opened a boarding house to support her family. My mother was just 16 at the time. Aunt Ettie Henrietta was 14, Harry was 9, and Leonard Leroy was 6 years old. Uncle Clarence was older and was working at the Lark mine. He met there a fellow who was working in the smelter. They became friends, and Uncle Clarence brought him home to meet his family. This man was Grover Hopkins. He was very good-looking and friendly. My mother and he fell in love. He was 12 years older than she, but that made him even more attractive. Grandma didn't approve of his age, didn't approve because of his age, but she didn't actively try to keep them apart. They dated for a while and then decided to elope. They were married on June 21st, 1910, at Ogden, Utah. They lived near Grandma for a while, then got a place near to her of their own. I should insert here why my dad was here working in a smelter, and some details of his past life. He had had a very unhappy life to this time. His father had died when he was just months old. His mother had married again when he was around 2. The stepfather and his mother both worked, so Daddy was put into a child care center. When he was 8 years old, his dearest sister Frances, Fanny they called her, was 12 years old, was taken very ill and died. He was at home that day and sitting on the porch. He said he saw a ship come up onto the yard. His sister Fanny came out of the house and floated up onto the ship, and it floated away and disappeared. In just a few minutes, he was told his sister had died. His oldest sister, Delia, had married, and when her first baby was born, both she and her baby died, which left just Daddy's older brother, Charles, and him. He was still at the care home or orphanage until he was 16 and old enough to get a job at one of the big mills. This was in the eastern part of the United States, in Maryland or Virginia. When he was still just a boy, his mother died, and his brother Charles collected the insurance, which he, Charles, had been helping to pay for. Charles had seemed so cold and untouched at the death of his mother that Daddy felt very bad, and he moved from the home and went out on his own. And as I said, he'd work in the mills or any place that he could get a job. When he was just past 21, so he could be married, he married a girl who he loved very much. Her name was Priscilla Parks. Before their first baby came, they knew she had tuberculosis of the lungs. So when the baby was born, which was a son, he was taken away and treated so that he would not have the disease. When the baby was 6 months old, Priscilla died, and my dad, who had contracted the disease, was told to go west into the desert countries. So he went to Phoenix, Arizona, and lived there until the disease was arrested. He had left his baby son with his wife's sister. They did not keep in touch, and they drifted apart, and he never saw his son again. He started working in mills wherever he could get a job, which eventually brought him to Utah and the mines at Bingham. Here he met my Uncle Clarence Lemon. They became friends, and when he was asked to come to meet the family, he was very happy for the family association. My mother at 16 was a beautiful girl, and helping Grandma with the boarding house brought out her friendly disposition. She was impulsive in showing her affection and feelings, so Daddy was attracted to her right away. Daddy and Grandma got along very well right from the beginning, and they kept this friendly feeling the rest of their lives. Let's see. Mom and Daddy lived in Garfield just a few months, and then they moved to a company house at Lark, which was near the mine. In a few months, Daddy was laid off at the Lark mine. Mom knew she was pregnant, so she went to Paradise to Aunt Lottie Pierce's, and Daddy went to McGill, Nevada to work in the mill there. I was born in Paradise, Cache County, Utah, on September 1, 1911. Aunt Lottie and Uncle Ed Pierce had 4 children at the time: Roy, Madge, Edna, and Annie, who was just 6 months older than me. My mother was only 17 when I was born, and a small person anyway, so there was some difficulty in my birth. She was in labor from early Thursday morning until Friday afternoon. Sister Louisa Gibbs was a qualified midwife and the only help Mom had. I was in a breech position with one leg down and the other up along my side. In this position, the card was pressed nearly closed, so there was just enough life-giving fluid coming through to barely keep me alive. I was badly dehydrated when I was born and looked like a shriveled apple. It was questionable that I would live. Sister Gibbs used the old method of real warm water and then cold water to dip me into first the warm and then the cold. She massaged me all over and blew into my nose until she finally got some air into my lungs. I was just a lifeless form, but she finally seemed to just will the life into me. I thank my Heavenly Father every day of my life for his love and Sister Gibbs. And as I think of all my children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, I thank him again and realize there was a very special life mission for me to fulfill. Mom was afraid I would not live, so she called Uncle Edgar Pierce and his father, Robert Pierce, and they blessed me on the 2nd of September, 1911. When I was just a few months old, Grandma Lemons brought her 3 children and moved to Paradise. She and my mother rented a house together. I have heard them talk of how bad the bedbugs were in that house and how they sprayed with coal oil on all the bed springs, mattresses, also around all door frames and window frames, and any place a bug could hide. Finally, they got rid of the bugs. There were a lot of fun times with all the families when they went fishing, camping, or had parties for birthdays and holidays. I remember Mom telling about a Christmas party they had and how they had the tree in the living room and kept the living room closed. The tree was all decorated, and Christmas Eve they opened the door after dinner, and everyone went in then to celebrate around the tree, to exchange gifts and sing Christmas songs. When I was about 15 months old, Mom took me and went to McGill, where Daddy had rented a house for us. But to go back, while we were in Paradise, near Aunt Lottie and all of them there, why, I've heard him talk about how Annie and I used to play together, and Mom said it was hard for me to get up and try to walk. I'd just get up on my feet, Annie would come running over and say, I'll help you, and then she'd push me down. So I didn't walk until I was, on account of my birth, my hip was bad. So I was almost 17 months old before I walked. But Mom took me and went to McGill, where Daddy had rented a house for us, and we were together as a family for the first time. We were at McGill until I was just past 2 years old. I have heard stories of the kind of house they lived in, just a mining town shack with no modern conveniences. There was a big rainstorm one day, which could have been fatal for Mom and me. It was a regular cloudburst and flood. The wall of water, which would have washed the house away, was split by a chicken wire fence just above the house. The water came together below us. The brush and rocks lodged against the fence turned the water away. It was in the daytime, so Daddy was at work. When I was 2 years old, Daddy was laid off at the smelter, so he and Mom decided to go to Arizona, where her 2 sisters were living. They rented a house there from Aunt Nancy Clarkson. It had 2 large rooms. Aunt Nan's, and I'll tell a little about Aunt Nan then. Aunt Nan's husband, Oscar, had died a few years before, so Aunt Nan and her mother-in-law lived in Aunt Nan's big house and rented the other one. This trip to Arizona on the train is one of my first memories. I remember kneeling on the seat in the train and looking out the window. If I watched the ground close to the track, I would get dizzy, and I seemed to be traveling in the opposite direction. I don't remember too much about the rest of the trip. We did have to lay over in Phoenix. which seemed like a very big town to me then, but it was nothing like it is now. We walked because that was some 70 years ago. We walked to a little boarding house where we got a room. It was past mealtime, so the landlady fixed us some fried egg sandwiches. I must have been really hungry because I still remember how good it tasted, and all my life I have loved fried egg sandwiches. When we finally arrived in Thatcher, Arizona, Aunt Ellie and Uncle John Stowe met us at the depot. They had my cousin Effie with them. She was 7 years old, but she seemed like an adult to me. They had a two-seated buggy, pulled by just one horse. It was the first ride I remember having in a buggy, and I watched as the horses bobbed up and down as he trotted. It was about 2 miles from the depot to Aunt Ellie's home, which was a ranch or farm south and west of Thatcher. It was so good to be where I could run around again. Effie took me out to show me all the animals and chickens. Before we went out, Effie took off my coat to put it away, and she kept saying, "Oh, it is so pretty." It is plain in my memory now. It was a pink poplin with a round yoke and eyelet lace on the collar. We stayed at Aunt Ellie's for a week or so and then moved into the house we rented from Aunt Nan, because I imagine there had to be some furniture got and some preparations made. And Mom at that time was pregnant with my sister Bernice. Aunt Nan had 3 girls. Thelma, who was almost 4 years older than me, which made her 6 years old. Her daughter, Aunt Nan's daughter Blanche, was near 11, and her daughter Flora was nearly 14. Daddy stayed at Thatcher for a month or so before going on to Globe to look for work, Globe, Arizona. He wanted to stay and farm in Thatcher, but there wasn't much farm work to be had at that time of year. We were in Thatcher for Christmas. I don't remember plainly about that year. Just at certain times, things happened that I do remember. About that time, my mother's sister Blanche, with her husband, Frank Gillespie, and 3 children, came from Klein, Colorado, by wagon and team to visit the 3 sisters. They had 3 boys, Charles, who was 6 years, Alvin was 3 years, and Joe was just past 1. They moved into the house where Mom and Daddy were living, the place they had rented from Aunt Nan. Frank Gillespie and my Uncle John Stowe took their teams and wagons and did some freighting for the government, taking supplies into Mexico. This was at the time of the uprising of Poncheville in Mexico, when the Mormons, who had gone there so they could live in polygamy, were driven out. They had to leave for their own safety. The U.S. government had troops at the border who had to be fed and housed, so they got supplies from the bordering states. This was in 1913. I remember times when all the sisters were together, either out at Aunt Ellie's or at Aunt Nan's. Blanche and my mom were good singers, and Daddy had a good voice, too. While they were together, they would sing songs. Some they all knew, and some Blanche had learned in Colorado. She taught these songs to Mom and Daddy, and they would sing together. Through the years, these songs have been learned and sang by all the children. Daddy sang and taught one song which made everybody cry. It was called The Orphan Boy. It was kind of like his life. The folks knew of his sad childhood, so they would cry too. All the songs were stories, like The Black Sheep, One Tiny Blue Shoe, The Fatal Rose of Red, and an Indian song, Red Wing. They got together for dinners and had chicken and lemon pie. I remember the pies, because one time Aunt Blanche and Mom had made some and set them on a windowsill to cool. Joe came along and took one down. He ate part of it and put the rest with the pie tin into the top of an open sack of flour. What a mess he was. Daddy and Flora each had a camera, so there were pictures taken. But through the years, these pictures have been lost or destroyed by fire, so there are none left to show how we looked at that age. Daddy finally got a job at Globe, Arizona, in the smelter. He rode the train whenever he came home for a visit. It wasn't such a terribly long way, but the trains didn't travel as fast as they do now, and the work weeks were 6 days, so he would be months between visits. I missed him when he was away, and I remember how I would try to run fast when I heard his voice talking to Mom and the others when he came home for a visit. He would hold me on his lap, and how I loved that. In March, Uncle Frank and Aunt Blanche left to go back to Colorado. That winter, though, had a lot of fun experiences that I remember when we children would all get out and play because it was warm down there, and Aunt Nan had a buggy that had shafts on it, that she just had one horse in it. So two of the big kids would take hold of the shafts of that buggy, and they'd push it so that it was on the upper part of Aunt Nan's back lawn because it was sloped to the back there. They'd push it out to the front, and it was sloped to the back. And all of the little ones would get in the buggy, and then two of the big kids would hold the shafts up, and then they'd run, and we'd get a ride in the buggy. And I can remember, even though I was just little, I can remember how fast it seemed like that buggy was going. I know it couldn't have been going very fast. I don't remember much about when Aunt Blanche and Uncle Frank left, but soon Mom and I were back out at Aunt Ellie's house because my sister Bernice was expected in April. I remember the day Bernice was born. Aunt Ellie had borne 9 children, so she was a pretty good nurse. She had sent her son George to tell Dr. Platt he was needed. When we got there, all of us children were sent outside to wait. We all knew what was going to happen, and I really watched to see what a start looked like when he was carrying a baby. Effie had turned 8 years old in February. She had been baptized the 1st of March, so it was still very much in her mind. While we waited outside, she drew in the dirt with a stick and explained to me all about the size of the baptismal font, how she went down the steps into the water and then held her nose tight when she was put down under the water. She told me what they had said to her before she was baptized, so it had really made an impression on her. After a long wait, Aunt Ellie came out and told me I had a baby sister. I was told I could come to see her if I just looked and didn't touch. I didn't see her much the next couple of weeks, but when Mom was able to bathe her, she would let me watch. It was such a wonder to me. She was like a doll, but she cried and wiggled so much I was fascinated and wanted so much to hold her. Mom would put her in my arms, but she always held on to her. Soon, Mom and I, were back out. When Bernice was a few months old, and Mom was able to be working again, we moved back to the house by Aunt Nan. Since Aunt Nan's husband had died, she had been doing the washing for a hotel in Safford. They brought it to her once a week. I've left some out here. When Bernice was a few months old and Mom was able to be working again, we moved back to the house by Aunt Nan. This house, as I said, was her mother-in-law's house, where she and Grandpa Clarkson had lived until the time of his death. We children called them Grandma and Grandpa Clarkson, but the adults, they were called Aunt Annie and Grandpa. Since Aunt Nan's husband had died, she had been doing the washing for a hotel in Safford. They brought it to her once a week. Huge bags of sheets, pillowcases, and towels. She had a big washer with a wooden tub, which she had to keep full of water between washing days, so this was a private pool for us children when it was not in use. It had a small gas motor, which sat away from it about 2 feet, and the belt which turned the motor was disconnected each time after she was through washing with it. The wringer had to be turned by hand, so it was a 2-person operation. I remember Mom and Aunt Nan and Grandma Clarkson working together out under the shed where it stood. They always sounded so happy, talking and laughing together. There were big trees all around the house, and the whole backyard was lawn, where the big clotheslines were strung out. It always took 3 days to do all the washing, and it was a happy time for us children. The washing was started early. Aunt Nan and Mom would get the water on to heat in the big tubs, while Grandma Clarkson got breakfast for everyone. The dishes and other house chores were then turned over to Aunt Nan's 2 daughters, Flora and Blanche, with Grandma helping and supervising. It seemed Daddy came home more often, and there were fun days when he was there. Aunt Nan had a big garden, and he loved to go out and try to water it. He did it so he could do it. There was also weeds to be pulled, and I was allowed to help if one of the big girls or Daddy was with me. Aunt Nan had chickens, and I loved the music they made during the time they were laying eggs. Aunt Ellie and Uncle John came to visit quite often. They always brought Effie with them, and usually they brought their daughter Clara. She was the age of Aunt Nan's daughter Flora, but Clara had been born with a bad heart condition. She was able to go to school a few days a week and then study at home, but she could not run and play with us. Aunt Nan had a phonograph, which everyone enjoyed. The records were cylinders about 8 inches long. They looked like a big piece of pipe to me. It had to be hand-wound for each record. I still remember hearing it play, and sometimes everyone sang along with it. I also remember some of the songs on the records. When Bernice was about 13 months old, we moved to Humboldt, Arizona. Daddy was working at a mill close by. I don't remember much about the trip there, but I remember the big old hotel we lived in. It was close to an area where a lot of small mines had been worked, and we children were warned to stay close to the hotel because there were big holes we could fall into. And I remember playing around the old hotel in Humboldt. There was a big door on the back that was lifted up. It laid almost flat on the ground and was lifted up to go down into the basement that was underneath the hotel. And us kids used to go up and run up and down that door, and I can remember what fun it was to run down, and sometimes I'd run too fast and fall down when I got to the bottom. We were in Humboldt just a month or so, and then we went to Hayden. I liked it better in Hayden because we had a house of our own with neighbors close by and children my age to play with. We lived in Hayden a couple of years. When Bernice had just turned 2 years old, in May, and we were still in Hayden, or June of 1916, Daddy took over a homestead from a man who had partly proved up on it. Daddy had to stay on his job to keep money coming in, so Mom took we 2 small children and moved to the homestead. The house was just one large room with no floor, but the dirt floor was as hard as cement. There was and she just spread rugs around on the floor. There were some chicken coops and fenced-in yards for the chickens, also a large cellar, which we used to keep our supplies in. We had chickens, but no cow for milk. It was here that I learned to love the taste of canned milk. There was a small garden already planted, but the water had to be hand-pumped to water it. There was a big mesquite fence around the house to keep the range cattle, because this was out where there was range cattle around, from coming too near. But sometimes the big bulls would start fighting, and I was so afraid they would come right through the fence. And Ellie's son, George, who was about 16 or 17, came to stay with us during that summer, and he was such a big help, pumping the water for the garden and cutting wood for our cook stove. Mom was a good cook, and I remember how good her cornbread tasted. To me, it was like having cake. That summer on the homestead was very hard for Mom. She was expecting my brother Edwin in December. In the desert